I'd never hated a place so much in my life. I had to get out before I succumbed to it. The Antarctic was no place to be lost, and we were lost. We were all in one large tent, half buried in the snow, surrounded by a sea of frozen ice and snow. It was 60 degrees below zero outside. Inside, the little stove warmed things up to about 10 below. We lay in our bags most of the time to keep warm. And we remembered our 4 friends who had disappeared into a crevasse a few days before, along with all of our navigational equipment and all but one of the dogs. We were all pretty weak from the constant exposure to sub-zero temperatures and the rapture of being in a freezing, white, endless space. Someone had to try to find the way to the rendezvous with the ship. It was then I said I knew which way the bay was, and I would leave immediately, though I didn't have a clue. I took a small amount of food, a sleeping bag, and some extra mittens. I wrote down our coordinates. Then I called to Bushman, the last of the Huskies. We said farewell, and just before we stepped out, one of my friends, who could no longer speak, handed me a torn piece of paper. On it were written the words, "When you come back, we will be here." I stood for a moment looking from face to face. In their eyes I saw trust but no hope. Then I turned, and Bushman and I stepped out into the blistering cold. The Antarctic was in its 6 months of dim light. The sun sat on the horizon as cold and as bright as a star in space. The sky was low and gray, the light flat. A steady wind had started up, swirling the loose snow around my knees. The land was flat and straight as far as you could see in every direction but one. There, far off, I saw the tips of ice spires barely jutting up over the horizon. I covered my face from the freezing cold and started jogging toward them. Bushman loped in front of me at a steady distance as though he was leading his team. I looked back after about a mile. The tent had dissolved into the landscape. I was glad to be moving away from that place, and we kept up a steady lope to keep warm and cover ground. The landscape didn't change as I moved through it, and I felt like I was running through eternity, and for a moment I had no hope. We traveled for many hours over the snow and ice, through the wind, until at last right in front of me were the ice spires rising out of the ground like a forest of giant icicles. I was near exhaustion, so I found a place out of the wind against one of the spires. I unrolled my bag and crawled in. I invited Bushman in, but instead he dug a small hole in the snow and curled into it. I threw him a piece of jerky. I ate some too, then tried to sleep, listening to the screeching of the wind through the tops of the spires. I was awakened suddenly by a sharp crack and looked up just in time to see the top of a spire break off in the brittle air and crash to the ground nearby. This was not a safe place to be, and I thought, if only I can get on the other side of this ice field. I had no plan other than that. Bushman sat there looking at me. I rolled up my bag, tied it to my back, and started snaking through the forest of ice spires. Mostly I followed Bushman. He seemed to know where he was going, but he quickly disappeared. It was hard to keep going in one direction because I had to weave through the ice field. While I moved along, I began to drift in my mind, and I I thought of my friends back there in the tent. At least they were a little warmer and had some food. I thought of their trust in me. They were depending on me to reach the ship, tell it to wait, then go back and lead them out. I thought of the ship, of all of us on the ship, sailing away from this lonely, desolate place, of putting in at a tropical island somewhere north of here, swimming in the warm turquoise waters, eating fruit and lying in the sun, the warm sun. I pictured it so clearly that for a moment I was there. And I thought this world is really quite small if you don't have to travel through it in a body. Suddenly I stopped and looked down. There at my feet was a chasm. The slit in the earth disappeared down into deep blackness. I had drifted off and almost fallen into it. I looked around to reorient myself. The ice spires rose around me, the crevasse dropped below, and the razor wind swirled through the canyons of ice. Just then a piece of the sun way off at the horizon peeked through the clouds, and a beam of light caught the top of the spire nearest me. It reflected to another spire, then another, and another, until all around me shafts of light shot through and through the ice spires, a random network of laser beams that hypnotized me with their sudden brilliance. And just as quickly they were gone, and I was too confused to move. I heard a bark, and there on the other side of the crevasse was Bushman, looking directly at me. I snapped out of my trance. He took a few steps away, then came back and looked at me again. He seemed to know where he wanted to go, and he definitely wanted me on the other side of the chasm. I walked back several yards, then turned and ran and leaped into the air. I landed hard on the opposite rim on my chest. For an instant my breath was gone, and I began to slip. I caught the edge just in time to keep from dropping out of sight, but I couldn't pull myself up. I kicked my foot into the side of the crevasse to get a toehold, but it was too hard. I couldn't hang on any longer. My frozen fingers were cramping, and I began to slip. Suddenly I felt something grab the top of my hood. There was a rip as Bushman's teeth cut through the material, then he began to pull. My face scraped over the ice as he dragged me upward. I could hear him growling deep in his throat. I hung from his powerful jaws for an instant, then I finally gripped an outcropping of ice, and in a second, I was lying on the other side of the crevasse. The great dog sat in front of me, panting. We looked at each other for a moment, then I said, "Thank you, Bushman." He wagged his tail, then turned and began loping away. I jumped up and started following him through the maze of spires again. He quickly disappeared. I struggled along after him, stumbling over the rough terrain, sometimes crawling on my hands and knees. My face was frozen stiff, and my fingers and toes were numb. After what seemed like days of constant walking in the pale light, I stepped out of the forest of ice spires onto a long, flat plain, white, stretching forever in bitter cold. It looked like I was back where I started. Just then the howling wind brought with it the throbbing sound of a ship's foghorn, and I knew I'd made it out to the other side. I began jogging in the direction of the sound. A few minutes later I could see tiny lights up ahead. I ran faster, and a feeling of triumph filled me. Then I stopped. Bushman, where was he? I looked back. The frozen landscape was empty in every direction. I called as loud as I could. A storm was approaching, and the ship sounded its horn once more. I said a silent goodbye to my furry friend and ran toward the ship, the tears freezing on my face. By the time I reached it, I was exhausted. They hoisted me up and took me to the officers' quarters. It was warm and cozy, and I told them my story. The captain was silent for a few seconds. Then he apologized and said they couldn't send a party back at this time. They were getting up steam to sail out to sea where they would ride out the storm that was coming. They would be back in 2 weeks, and I must stay with them and help them back when the time came. It would be suicide to stay in the storm. I agreed, but I thought of my friends somewhere out there on the ice. I was afraid they would die without hope. I bundled up and went back out on deck. I stood on the fantail looking off into the lowering clouds and razor-cold winds. The ice was closing in around the ship. Then I heard a noise and looked down. There was Bushman standing on the ice looking up at me. He barked again. This great furry dog had saved my life, and in an instant I knew what I must do. I ran below and got a compass. I wrote down the ship's coordinates and left a note on the captain's bunk. Back on deck, I tied off a line and slid down to the ice. I hugged Bushman, and together we disappeared back into the storm. Later, the captain would read the note. It had been written on a torn piece of paper in a shaky hand. It said, "When you come back, we will be here."